Got so angry, I got the dates wrong. Here's a TARQUIN reshoot. Last night, Sunday the 17th of May 2020, the Office of National Statistics released data which showed that there had now been 34,636 fatalities due to the COVID-19 outbreak in the United Kingdom. The true figure is expected to be higher due to missed cases and reporting lags. On Tuesday the 5th of May, the government had been obliged to announce a total of 29,427 deaths attributed to the virus. This meant that the UK had, as widely predicted, overtaken Italy for the worst mortality figures in Europe. Huzzah! Britain finally beats Europe. As of yesterday, the UK had the 4th highest reported infection rate and the 2nd highest coronavirus death toll in the world. Quite simply, the UK had 4 weeks clear warning of the looming peril after Italian authorities began imposing strict quarantine restrictions in the Lombardy region on the 22nd of February. But our own government was slow to respond, preferring instead to wallow in Brexit triumphalism and British exceptionalism while offering vague assurances and dubious advice. The word hubris springs to mind here. Well, what did you expect, eh? None of this should come as any surprise since the country voted for a Conservative government led by Boris Johnson in December 2019. Amiable, clownish, bumbling, some may regard Johnson as an amusing chap, a typical British eccentric. Sadly, they would be quite wrong. Any cursory examination of his career exposes him as a liar and a fantasist. Moreover, his grasp of detail, outside of anything that may further his own ends, is tenuous. His cabinet, a bunch of dutifully sycophantic Europhobes, is largely untalented. Lurking in the background is his special advisor, Dominic Cummings, a controversial figure who openly expresses contempt for Parliament and the civil service. Our ridiculous first-past-the-post system has finally brought us to the brink of an elected dictatorship. Johnson announced the first measures to ease the lockdown on Sunday the 10th of May. Despite being pre-recorded, the speech was shambolic, entirely Johnsonian. It was another woolly effort to please all sides while ultimately looking after the moneymen. Proper guidance and firm decisions could wait. Those who were not angered by its lack of substance were left wondering what it was supposed to mean. People were urged to return to work, but there was no deep commitment to their safety. Avoid public transport? Then how to get to work? And a workplace that might not be safe distance was okay, but meeting even a few loved ones still wasn't? COVID-19 is Boris Johnson's moment of truth. While good at climbing the greasy pole, he's ill-equipped to deal with external pressures and did not take appropriate action until it was nearly too late. I think the Tories did just enough, just in time to avert the very worst effects of the virus. It was a perilously close thing. A combination of dogma, complacency and hubris created systemic failings in areas such as the provision of PPE. It has led to a mortality rate that, given what was happening in other European countries, should be much lower. For many Western countries, the 30 years after the Second World War were a period of peace and prosperity thanks to social democracy. Even the Tories had to accept that state intervention was the new status quo. But in the 1970s, Western economies began to slow down, not least because of drastic hikes in the price of oil. A minor economic cult seized its opportunity, whispering into the ears of the political right and blaming the downturn on government overspending. This fledgling dogma, now called neoliberalism, was music to the ears of Tory hardliners. Free markets, low taxes, privatisation of state assets, minimal government interference. Surely that was the road to growth and prosperity for all. No. Neoliberalism is another god that failed. Western economies are underperforming. Workers' wages have been stagnant for well over a quarter of a century. In-work benefits have been slashed and insecurity greatly exacerbated by demands for a flexible workforce. For all our apparent wealth, this generation is worse off than its parents. Yet inequality is rising to levels not seen since the 1930s. Let the wealth creators keep their money, said the Tories, and New Labour, to be fair, for it will trickle down. But it didn't. Deregulated finance is mobile, and so the money vanished offshore. So what have tax loopholes, deregulation, privatisation and austerity actually achieved? A transfer of wealth from the poorest to those who least need it. Perhaps that's what it was all about in the first place. The Thatcher-Reagan consensus still holds sway. Johnson and Trump just the latest high priests of what is morphing into a far-right libertarian death cult that condemns millions to precarity, penury and an early grave. Welfare is no longer affordable. The profit margin is paramount. The rejection of the welfare state brings us back to what, thanks to the current crisis, turns out to be the most indispensable of all public services. Health and social care workers have had to step into the front line as rarely before. Dealing with unprecedented numbers of seriously ill people, they are at much greater risk themselves. The shameful lack of planning on the part of the government highlights the corrosive effects of decades of Tory free market dogma. And by systematically underfunding healthcare in the name of austerity, successive health secretaries have deliberately demoralised and destabilised the NHS, thus paving the way for its privatisation. The belief that private provision is always more efficient than state provision remains unshakable, despite abundant evidence to the contrary from the United States. I find it shameful that Conservatives are now frantically applauding the health service they so diligently tried to destroy. It is deeply ironic that the success of the NHS is now their last line of defence against charges of incompetence and negligence. Brace yourselves, this won't be the last crisis coming over the hill. Scientists are expressing alarm over our intrusion into the planet's remaining wild spaces, our increasing contact with an already stressed environment. Our taste for international travel ensures that viruses such as COVID-19 spread rapidly. Unchecked climate change brought about by human-generated global warming will render significant parts of the planet uninhabitable in the next few decades. Poverty and inequality will force millions to live in acutely unhealthy conditions. The world's poor will suffer most if we do nothing. They are not inclined to worry about reassuring investors when their crops fail because there is too little or too much rain, or when their homes are constantly flooded or consumed by wildfires, or when the most deprived areas of coastal cities are devastated by increasingly violent storms and rising sea levels. The need to address such problems is urgent, yet the standard neoliberal response is to justify inaction. The necessary measures are too expensive. They will damage the economy. Note how members of the death cult are already using such language in relation to virus relief measures. In their eyes, the economy is always far more important than human life. Johnson's speech on easing the lockdown was an expression of that core belief. Besides, dead people can't claim benefits. Neoliberal economics assigns no intrinsic value to the natural world, despite the way corporations zealously exploit its resources. Perhaps that was true of post-war social democracy as well, given its reliance on artificially low oil prices for so many years. But social democracy was not wholly fixated on exchange value, on monetising every aspect of our lives, which is why I think it offers us a chance to reassess our values, adapt to changing circumstances, and begin to mitigate the damage. Since the appearance of the COVID-19 virus, many nations have returned to the kind of collective action we took for granted 50 years ago. Governments have been obliged to spend because the alternative, doing nothing, is too awful to contemplate, at least in the short term. The death cult is closing in, however. Its devotees are already demanding that the economy takes precedence over people's lives. They even raise the threat of post-virus austerity, of worsening mental health and poverty if we don't make sacrifices now, as if they hadn't been inflicting such conditions on the poor since 2010. For the rest of us, surveys show that not dying to shore up someone else's investment still takes priority, personal financial difficulties or not. If we can resist the machinations of a super wealthy minority, if we can cease regarding everything in terms of money, if we can revive the collective spirit, we may be able to forge something positive from this ordeal, the initiation of a debate. The topics are obvious: equality, a fairer redistribution of wealth and resources, and ultimately the preservation of the earth. I leave you with a quote from John Maynard Keynes, perhaps the most perceptive of 20th century economists. Instead of using their vastly increased material and technical resources to build a wonder city, the men of the 19th century built slums, which, on the test of private enterprise, paid, whereas the wonder city would, they thought, have been an act of foolish extravagance which would, in the imbecile idiom of the financial fashion, have mortgaged the future. The same rule of self-destructive financial calculation governs every walk of life. We destroy the beauty of the countryside because the unappropriated splendours of nature have no economic value. We are capable of shutting off the sun and the stars because they do not pay a dividend. Thank you. Chin chin.